Welcome to the 16th and final session of our study on the book of Genesis. This week we read chapters 49 and 50. We have a poem where Jacob blesses each of his sons and tells what their future has in store for them. Jacob dies and his sons return his body to be buried in Canaan. Joseph once again assures his brothers that his descent into Egypt has been part of God's plan to turn evil into good. Our story ends with the death of Joseph and the placement of his body in an aron, a coffin. But before all that, we begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we've learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. This is our last session. So I wanted to begin by looking back quickly at the original objectives of this study. Of course, we wanted to hear the stories of the creation and of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. We wanted to know what these stories could tell us about the nature of God and God's relationship with humanity, and in particular the people of Israel. But we also said we wanted to try to hear these stories the way they were originally written. We said we wanted to look at how the authors and redactors and editors have created not just a series of stories, but a unified message about God and his relationship and his expectations and desires for the nation of Israel. The first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis are called the primeval history. Chapter 1 begins with an account of the origins of the world, of the vegetable and animal kingdom, and of humankind. Displeased with his original efforts in the middle of this process, God attempts a do-over. He floods all the earth and starts over again with a new human and his family. Noah and his companions survive 40 days and nights of rain in a teva, an ark. We have a narrative explanation of the origins of all the known peoples from Greece to Africa to Mesopotamia and Asia Minor and the primary institutions of civilization, including the story of Babel and the source of the division of languages. The other major section is the patriarchal tales. God calls Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees at the beginning of chapter 12. Abraham is promised that God will make a great nation out of him, and that his seed will be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. As we move on to the story of the beginnings of the Israelite nation, the national focus of the narrative is given moral depth. Though the universal perspective of the first part of Genesis, the primeval history, is never really forgotten. While the first 11 chapters deal with origins, the patriarchal tales are concerned with what is to be. Abraham's heirs are promised the land of Canaan and seed that will be great as the stars. While Abraham becomes the obedient servant and ultimately a leader, his son Isaac, nearly sacrificed as a small child, appears to be little more than a placeholder. Isaac's wife, Rebekah, helps her son Jacob steal the inheritance that rightfully belongs to his brother. Jacob, the great deceiver, wrestles with God and is renamed Israel. His 12 sons are to become the 12 tribes of Israel, but not right away. Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, is despised by his brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt, where he becomes Pharaoh's governor and helps save the world with his own family from famine. The characters in the tales grow more and more human personality as the narrative moves on. God, the only being to speak in chapter 1, is heard from less and less as the story continues. Joseph, unlike the earlier patriarchs, is never spoken to directly by God. In the story of Joseph and his brothers, we find the seeds and the character of the nation of Israel that is to follow hundreds of years into the future. All evidence points to there having been, in the earliest religious thought, a vision of the cosmos that was profoundly cyclical. No event is unique. Nothing is enacted but once. Every event has been enacted, is enacted, and will be enacted perpetually. The same individuals have appeared, appear, and will appear at every turn of the circle. The writers of the Torah, of Genesis, were the first people to break out of this circle, to find a new way of thinking and experiencing, a new way of understanding and feeling the world. The writers of the book of Genesis saw a future that was different than the past. The patriarchal tales are about the future. Your seed will be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. In this study, we talked about the documentary hypothesis that says there are 3 primary written sources that were combined by a redactor in the late 6th or early 5th century BCE to create what we know today as the Torah, which includes the book of Genesis. The basic hypothesis is generally accepted among Old Testament scholars, even as the details are frequently disputed. Some scholars maintain that the Joseph story, for example, had a different primary source other than the J, P, and E that we've talked about. There are, of course, many preachers out there who have never heard of the documentary hypothesis and may insist that Moses wrote the 5 books of the Torah. We discussed the efforts that some modern translators have made to use English translation that more accurately reflects the original Hebrew of the Torah to show the wordplay, repetition, literary diction, and rhythm that was given by the original authors. Mark Brett suggested that the early readers or listeners of the book of Genesis might have discerned the undertones of anti-exclusivism found in Genesis that were intended to subvert the official government policy of ethnocentricity in Judah in the mid-5th century BCE. We also talked about ways that we might identify what the writers or redactors saw as the voice of God in these stories. I've used 3 primary translations in this study and 3 corresponding commentaries. I primarily used Robert Alter's translations, but the commentaries I've mixed and matched, occasionally used some other outside sources or threw in some of my own thoughts. Just like the redactor combined the 3 primary sources and occasionally used other outside sources or added his own writing. Unlike the work of the redactor, though, I don't claim that my own thoughts added any significant value to the process. Probably 90 to 95% of what you heard in the commentary I've used in these videos was directly quoted or adapted from Robert Alter, Everett Fox, or Richard Elliott Friedman. As I said at the beginning of the study, I am no expert. Any comments I added of my own were either incidental or in at least one case I later discovered inaccurate. If you want to know exactly what these scholars actually wrote, you'll have to buy their books. So there is a complete bibliography in the handout and in the credits at the end of this video. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, you certainly may email those to genesis.online@northgateumc.org, or if you prefer some small measure of anonymity, send them to office@northgateumc.org. Those addresses are also in the credits at the end of this video. So we go on to chapter 49, and I'm going to start with verse 1. And Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather round, that I may tell you what shall befall you in the days to come." So we're ready to read a poem. It's generally agreed among scholars that the poem in chapter 49 is one of the oldest extended texts in the Bible. It represents Levi as a tribe deprived of inheritance without saying anything about sacred or priestly responsibilities. This suggests that it may have been written before the completion of the settlement following Exodus. However, the royal imagery, on the other hand, associated with Judah seems to reflect a date after David's founding of his dynasty, shortly before 1000 BCE. It is also possible that this is not a single poem, but a combination of poems written over an extended period of time. Because of the antiquity of the poem, there are a number of words and phrases that are not well understood. So there are multiple cases where translations vary considerably from one translator to the next. There are also problems with the Masoretic text in a couple of places, which make the translation even more difficult. As we read this, it certainly feels like it comes from antiquity. It sounds different than much of what we've already read. But we also remember that the interpretation of what any particular passage means depends on how the words and phrases are translated. This is poetry. So like all poetry, it's full of simile and metaphor. We look for parallelism and imagery and allusion and hyperbole. If the translators don't agree on what the Hebrew words mean, we cannot expect the interpretation of the meaning of these passages to be consistent from one translation to the next. And they aren't. I'm again reading from Robert Alter's translation. So we go on with verse 2 through 7. Assemble and hearken, O Jacob's sons, and hearken to Israel your father. Reuben, my firstborn are you, my strength and first yield of my manhood, prevailing in rank and prevailing in might. Unsteady as water, you'll no more prevail. For you mounted the place where your father lay, you profaned my couch, you mounted. Simeon and Levi, the brothers, weapons of outrage their trade. In their council, let me never set foot. Their assembly my presence shun. For in their fury they slaughtered men. At their pleasure they tore down ramparts. Cursed be their fury so fierce, and their wrath so remorseless. I will divide them in Jacob, disperse them in Israel. In verse 3 and 4, the biological image of Reuben as the product of Jacob's first inseminating seed sharpens the contrast with the next line about Reuben's violation of his father's concubine. There is a reference here to the early disappearance of the tribe of Reuben, maybe even prior to the end of the monarchy. Jacob is clearly not happy with Simeon and Levi. From the beginning, Simeon's tribe was dispersed within the tribe of Judah, and Levi's tribe never had a land of its own. We go on with 8 through 10. Judah, you shall your brothers acclaim. Your hand on your enemy's nape, your father's sons shall bow to you. A lion's whelp is Judah. From the prey, O my son, you must mount. He crouched, he lay down like a lion, like the king of beasts. And who dare arouse him? The scepter shall not pass from Judah, nor the mace from between his legs. The tribute to him may come, and to him the submission of peoples. So here's Judah. Judah, you shall your brothers acclaim. In Hebrew, this would be read as Yehuda Atahuyo Duk Ha Akiha. So this is a pun on Judah's name. We don't really understand that because we don't understand the Hebrew, but that's how that works. Judah now displaces his three brothers born before him, and his claim is based on military prowess. Your hand upon your enemy's nape sounds like King David. We've talked about how the vocabulary of ancient Hebrew is so much smaller than modern English. The use of the word lion here is an exception. Hebrew has 5 different words for lion, while there are no English synonyms for it. In verse 9, Alter substituted the king of beasts, just to pick something a little different. We go on with 11 through 12. This is still Judah we're talking about. He binds to the vine his ass, to the grape bough his ass's foal. He washes in wine his garment, in the blood of the grape his cloak. O eyes that are darker than wine, and teeth that are whiter than milk. Abraham Ibn Ezra interpreted verse 11 to mean the yield of his vineyard will be so abundant that his ass can turn aside to the vine and he won't care if it eats the grapes. Massive, massive grapevines. His vineyard's so great it doesn't matter. The wine will be so abundant that it can be treated as water. We go on with 13 through 15, some of the other brothers. Zebulun near the shore of the sea shall dwell, and he by the haven of ships, his flank upon Sidon. Ishkar, a big-boned donkey, crouched amidst hearths. He saw that the homestead was goodly, and that the land was delightful, and he put his shoulder to the load, becoming a toiling serf. Zebulun will be near the sea, flank upon Sidon. This sounds more like it describes the territory of Asher, at least in the map that I've looked at. Ishkar is described as becoming a toiling serf. He's going to work by the sweat of his brow. We go on with 16 through 21. Dan his folk will judge as one of Israel's tribes. Let Dan be a snake on the road, an asp on the path that bites the horse's heels, and its rider topples backwards. Your deliverance I await, O Lord. Gad shall be goaded by raiders, yet he shall goad their heel. Asher's bread shall be rich, and he shall bring forth kingly dishes. Naphtali, a hind let loose, who brings forth lovely fawns. Dan was judged as one of the Israel's tribes despite the fact that he was marginal and forced to migrate from south to north. Dan attacked like a snake alongside of the road. Unlike the other tribes, Dan never had the security of a fortified settlement, so he was alongside the road. We also read that Asher's bread shall be rich. The snake imagery for Gad carries over from Dan. It's intended as a darting, agile, lethal assault. Naphtali brings forth lovely fawns. I don't really know what that's supposed to mean, but it sounds like a positive kind of thing. We go with verse 22 through 26. This is Joseph. A fruitful son is Joseph, a fruitful son by a spring, daughters strode by a rampart. They savaged him, shot arrows, and harassed him, the archers did. But taut was his bow, his arms ever moving. Through the hands of the champion of Jacob, through the name of the shepherd and Israel's rock, from the God of your fathers may he aid you. Shaddai, may he bless you. Blessings of the heavens above, blessings of the deep that lies below, blessings of the breasts and womb. Your father's blessings surpass the blessing of timeless heights, the bounty of the hills everlasting. May they rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the one set apart from his brothers. Clearly Joseph is the favorite here. Verse 22 suggests that Joseph has the twin blessings of fruitfulness and military security. The young women can walk safely along the rampart because they will be protected. Verse 24, his arms ever moving through the hands of champion of Jacob. The idea is that the hands of the human warrior are given strength by God's hands. The Masoretic text is unintelligible for most of verse 26, so Alter's translation follows the Septuagint for the first part of the verse. Your father's blessings surpass the blessings of timeless heights. The bounty of hills everlasting, may they rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the one set apart from his brothers. We go on with verse 27. Benjamin, ravening wolf, in the morn he consumes the spoils, at evening shares our plunder. This last vignette for Benjamin is one of the sharpest images of death-dealing animals. Judges especially describes the tribe of Benjamin as being known for its military prowess. So short, but scary. 28 through 33 to the end of the chapter. These are the tribes of Israel, 12 in all, and this is what their father spoke to them, blessing them, and each according to his blessing. He blessed them, and he charged them and said to them, I am about to be gathered to my kinfolk. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which faces Mamre in the land of Canaan, the field that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite as a burial holding. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah, the field, and the cave within it, bought from the Hittites. And Jacob finished charging his sons, and he gathered his feet up into the bed, and he breathed his last, and he was gathered to his kinfolk. In Jacob's last speech, he shows an elaborate consciousness of the legal transaction between his grandfather and Ephron the Hittite. At the end of the Genesis, we renew a major theme. Abraham's offspring are legitimately bound to the land that God promised them, and the descent into Egypt is just a sojourn. We go on to chapter 50, and we'll start with verse 1 through 3. And Joseph flung himself on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph charged his servants and physicians to embalm his father. And the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 full days were taken for him, as such as the full time of embalming. And the Egyptians keened for him 70 days. We see here the 3 established characteristics of Joseph. He weeps, he flings himself on another's face, and he kisses them. We've seen that several times in here. Joseph is the intellectual, dispassionate interpreter, central planner, and a man of powerful, spontaneous feeling. Jacob can be mummified because he is the father of Pharaoh's viceroy, and also because his body needs to withstand this long trip to central Canaan. The time frames used here, 40 days and 70 days, are the Hebrew formula rather than the normal Egyptian time periods. We go from 4 through 14. And the days for keening him passed, and Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If, pray, I have found favor in your eyes, speak, pray, in Pharaoh's hearing as follows. My father made me swear, saying, Look, I am about to die. In the grave I readied me, in the land of Canaan, there you must bury me. And so let me go up, pray, and bury my father and come back. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father as he made you swear. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and all Pharaoh's servants, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt went up with him, and all of the household of Joseph and his brothers and his father's household. Only their little ones and their flocks and their cattle they left behind in the land of Goshen. And chariots and horsemen as well went up with him. And the procession was very great, and they came as far as Goren ha-Atad, which is across the Jordan. And there they keened a great and heavy keening, and performed mourning rites for his father 7 days. And the Canaanite natives of the land saw the mourning in Goren ha-Atad, and they said, This heavy mourning is Egypt's. Therefore is its name called Abel Mizraim, which is across the Jordan. And his sons did for him just as he had charged them. And his sons conveyed him to the land of Canaan, and buried him in the cave of the Machpelah field, the field Abraham had bought as a burial holding from Ephron the Hittite, facing Mamre. And Joseph went back to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father, after he had buried his father. Joseph has to ask permission to return to Canaan with his brothers to bury his father. There may have been concern that he wouldn't come back. After all, he is a key administrator in Pharaoh's court, so Joseph's request includes an all-important promise to come back. Pharaoh sends a whole entourage with Joseph and his brothers, which is an honor, of course, but it also is an effective method for ensuring that they do in fact return to Egypt. The route they took found them east of the Jordan, which was certainly not the shortest route. The shortest route would have been right up the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Maybe this circuitous route through the Sinai north on the east side of the Jordan meant to prefigure the route Moses took later in Exodus. We go with 15 through 21. And Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, and they said, If Joseph bears resentment against us, he will surely pay us back for all the evil we caused him. And they charged Joseph, saying, Your father left us a charge before his death, saying, Thus you shall say to Joseph, We beseech you, forgive, pray the crime and the offense of your brothers. For evil they have caused you, and so now forgive, pray, the crime of the servants of your father's God. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And his brothers then came and flung themselves before him and said, Here we are, your slaves. And Joseph said, Fear not, for am I instead of God? While you meant evil toward me, God meant it for good, so as to bring about at this very time keeping many people alive. And so fear not, I will sustain you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke to their hearts. The brothers tell Joseph that their father left a charge before his death, that Joseph was to forgive them. At this point, Jacob can't deny this, so we don't know if he really did this or not, but in any case, Joseph weeps again and assures them once again that it has been God's purpose to turn evil into good. We go with 22 through 26. This is through the end of the chapter. And Joseph dwelled in Egypt, he and his father's household. And Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw the third generation of sons from Ephraim. And the sons as well of Machir, son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, and God will surely single you out and take you up from this land to the land he promised to Isaac and to Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, when God indeed singles you out, you shall take up my bones from this place. And Joseph died, 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. In verse 24, Joseph says to his brothers that God will surely single you out and take you up from this land to the land he promised to Isaac and Jacob. This, of course, lays the ground for the end of Genesis and the movement out of Egypt in Exodus. He expects to be mummified and wants to have his body returned to Canaan like his father before him. The book that begins with an image of God's breath moving across the vast expanses of the primordial deep to bring the world and all life into being ends with this image of a body in a box, a mummy in a coffin. Out of the contraction of this moment of mortuary enclosure, a new expansion, a new birth will follow. Exodus begins with a proliferation of births, a pointed repetition to the primeval blessing to be fruitful and multiply. And just as the survival of the flood was represented as a second creation, the leader who is to forge the creation of the nation will be born on the water in a little box. Not the Aron, the coffin of the end of Genesis, but the Teva, the ark that kept Noah and his seed alive. As we conclude this study of the book of Genesis, I want to thank you for your participation in this somewhat new and unusual type of study, and I welcome any comments that you might have. Meanwhile, be safe, and I hope to see you Wednesday.